Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 101, General Psychology, and today we're going to be talking about learning. So when we talk about learning, we're broadly talking about acquiring new and relatively enduring information or behaviors that we enact in the future, and all of us do this. Learning is extremely helpful in many ways. It helps us adapt to environments, helps us prepare for events that we're going to be encountering, helps us to repeat ideal or desirable acts or behaviors, and it helps us avoid undesirable behaviors. There are two primary ways in which we can learn about things or our environments. One is through association. This is otherwise broadly known as conditioning. Conditioning helps us learn habitual behaviors, for example, and it can also be divided into two separate types of conditioning that we're going to get into more depth about, classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, we're focusing on how two different stimuli are associated with one another, and with operant conditioning, we're focusing on associating specific behaviors with either positive or negative consequences. Additionally, we can also not only learn through conditioning, but we can also learn through observation or through more cognitive means, such as language. In this way, we're acquiring mental information that is going to be guiding our behavior. So let's start off by talking about classical conditioning. And this idea of classical conditioning was established by Ivan Pavlov. He was researching something else completely, not focused on psychology. And he was researching salivation of a dog. Notice that the dog was salivating in response to seeing food, but the dog was also salivating in response to seeing the food bowl. So salivation was occurring without food being present. He basically went through a couple of different techniques, which we'll get into a little bit more detail about, but he ended up training the dog to salivate to a stimulus, an event that shouldn't trigger salivation, that is, the ringing of a bell. So why did this happen? Well, the dog basically ended up connecting the instance of one stimulus with the instance of another. So when the dog saw the dog bowl, he knew that food was coming soon. Similarly, when the dog heard a bell, the ringing of the bell, the dog knew that food was coming soon. That's kind of what happened with Pavlov's training. And so the dog ended up responding in the same way to the bell as the dog would typically respond to the presence of food. So when we talk about classical conditioning, there are a lot of terms that are easy to get confused. But the basic premise is we can think of a stimulus and we can think of a response. We, as people, respond to objects or stimuli that we see in the environment. And these can be divided into conditioned or unconditioned stimuli and conditioned and unconditioned responses. Basically, when we talk about conditioned responses or conditioned stimuli, these are learned. So a conditioned response would be a learned response, something we wouldn't typically do in reaction to a specific object or wouldn't naturally do. Conditioned stimuli would be a stimulus that elicits a specific response that we typically wouldn't respond to if it was natural. And unconditioned focuses on natural responses, stimuli that elicit natural responses or natural responses. So what's happening with the dog? So initially we have an unconditioned response. That would be salivating to food. This is something that naturally occurs when a dog sees food. So unconditioned response to an unconditioned stimulus. What Pavlov did was he paired food with a bell. So he paired the unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus, a stimulus that shouldn't have any specific response associated with it, that is the ringing of a bell. After pairing these two events multiple times, the dog started to figure out, all right, the bell is signaling when food's about to come. So we see the dog create a conditioned stimulus out of the bell, that is, the bell is eliciting salivation, and that salivation in itself becomes a conditioned response to the bell. We're salivating to the bell. This is something that wouldn't naturally occur when we hear the ringing of a bell. So there are a couple different things that are happening here. One is acquisition. This is learning the stimulus-response relationship whenever a stimulus is presented. Generally, so when we think about the bell and salivation, the bell appeared before the food was presented. So the bell signaled that food was about to come to the animal. And that's really what needs to happen if you want to create a conditioned stimulus. This neutral stimulus needs to appear before the unconditioned stimulus, so that way it's signaling the appearance of the US, or the unconditioned stimulus. You can also sometimes have a neutral stimulus appear before a conditioned stimulus, and that's what's known as higher order conditioning, or second order conditioning. That's when you have a neutral stimulus that's signaling a conditioned stimulus, which in itself would be signaling an unconditioned stimulus. So imagine if we had a flash of light that would signal when the bell was about to be rung, which would signal when the food was about to be presented. So acquisition is occurring in the Pavlov dog example, but what if we want to get rid of this response to the bell? Well, we would have to go through what's known as extinction. That's when we stop following a conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So for example, we would ring the bell, but then food wouldn't occur afterwards. In that sense, the bell would stop signaling to the dog that food was about to come, and then you might not see salivation to the bell like you did before, because it wouldn't really signal anything. Sometimes you can see what's known as spontaneous recovery. So maybe the bell hasn't been rung a lot after it was extinguished. All of a sudden you'll see one ring of the bell, and then the dog will salivate again just like it used to. So it's not the case that in extinction the conditioned response is eliminated entirely, it's just suppressed. We can also focus on other aspects of classical conditioning, such as generalization. So ideally, if we want to increase the conditioned response, the salivation to a bell, we would try to make sure that it's generalized, that it applies to many different situations, for example. And we ideally would like the dog to discriminate. So maybe we want the dog to only respond to low-toned bells, but not high-toned bells. We can train the dog to discriminate between those. So this is a form of learning and a form of conditioning that is extremely basic. It occurs in pretty much every animal that exists, every animal that can learn. And it's an ideal way of studying learning objectively. Again, we're only focusing on behaviors. If you think about the behaviorist movement, Pavlov fits right in there, studying behaviors, not worrying about how people are thinking about responses or behaviors. Classical conditioning is also extremely helpful for reducing fears or modifying behaviors. If people start to associate things that they're afraid of with happiness, such as spiders, then they start to become less afraid of this. So classical conditioning is extremely helpful for modifying behaviors. Now let's talk about operant conditioning. This is when people associate specific behaviors that they perform with specific consequences. That can either be positive consequences, so this is an example of reinforcement. This oftentimes increases the frequency of behavior, or it can be associated with negative consequences. This would be examples of punishment, and these decrease instances of behavior. Operant conditioning started off again in the behaviorist period. We're focusing on behaviors here, with B.F. Skinner. So a lot of his research was driven by Thorndike's law of effect, the idea that positive behaviors that are reinforced are going to continue to occur. And Skinner had many studies. He focused a lot of his research on rats and sometimes pigeons. He designed a box specifically for these animals that allowed them to perform a specific behavior. So in rats, that would be pressing a lever, and in pigeons, that would be pecking a little circle. And every time they did this, they got reinforced with either food or water. And so he was able to shape the animal's behavior, get them to behave in specific ways depending on the rewards or punishments in some situations that Skinner applied. Some important terms to think about when we talk about operant conditioning. Positive reinforcement is when we reinforce a behavior, again, strengthen a behavior by presenting some kind of desirable stimulus, so some kind of reward, could be food, could be water. Negative reinforcement is when we take away an aversive stimulus in order to reinforce behavior. So that would be maybe getting rid of a loud noise if a rat presses a lever, and he's going to be happier after that. And we can also have unconditioned and conditioned reinforcers. So unconditioned reinforcers are things that naturally reinforce behavior. So again, thinking back to unconditioned means natural, conditioned means kind of programmed or conditioned. So unconditioned is an example of those would be food or water, whereas conditioned reinforcers, a great example of this would be money. We don't really get any sustenance from money, but money allows us to acquire food and water. In terms of reinforcing behavior, we can reinforce behaviors in different ways, and we can decide how frequently and how contingent our reinforcement is going to be on behavior. So with continuous behaviors, with continuous reinforcement, we present the consequence or the reinforcement after every instance of behavior. Learning increases pretty substantially and quickly if we have continuous reinforcement, and we also see that behaviors are extinguished pretty rapidly in this case. But most often than not, we'll see what's known as intermittent reinforcement. This is when reinforcement occurs not every single time a behavior has occurred, but in some kind of pattern. And this leads to more gradual types of learning and more gradual types of extinction. There are different schedules that we can use within intermittent reinforcement. A fixed ratio schedule is when reinforcement occurs after a set number of behaviors. So if you have little cards from a coffee shop, after you purchase every 10 drinks, you get one free. That's an example of fixed ratio reinforcement. Variable ratio reinforcement is when it occurs after a varying number of behaviors. So you don't know how many behaviors you're going to need to perform to get that reinforcement, but you're going to keep doing it anyway to try and get it. So this is a slot machine is a great example of this type of reinforcement. You keep pulling the lever, pulling the slot machine handle to get money, but you don't know how many times you're going to have to do it to get the money. Fixed interval schedule is when you're reinforced after a set amount of time. So this would be when you check the mail around the same time every day, because you know when the mail comes. You know, about 24 hours from the last time you check, you perform the behavior again, you're probably going to get the mail. And a variable interval schedule is when you're reinforced after a variable amount of time, a varying amount of time. So you know that people are going to comment or like your Facebook post, but you don't know how long it's going to take until that happens. So you keep checking to try and see when that behavior of posting is going to be reinforced positively. And it can differ from post to post. With intermittent schedules, generally we see that ratio schedules tend to encourage stronger responses, and that variable schedules tend to encourage more consistent responses. So it really depends on what type of response you want to figure out what type of schedule you should enact. So we talked about reinforcement. What about punishment? Well, punishments are consequences that weaken future behavior, future instances of that behavior. So it could consist of shocking someone after they perform behavior. It could be spanking after bad behavior in children. In general, the punished behavior is suppressed but not forgotten. It's just discouraged. And unfortunately, with punishment, it can teach the individual who's being punished to fear behaving in that way, or fear the person who's delivering the punishment. And it can also increase aggression. People normally respond to aggression by also being aggressive, so that's a problem. Similar to reinforcement, we have both positive and negative forms of punishment. Positive punishment is when we administer an adverse stimulus after an instance of behavior, so that would be spanking. Negative punishment is when we remove a rewarding stimulus after punishment. So this would be timeout, removing a child from playing with their toys if they behave badly. So thinking in terms of operant conditioning, Skinner was a very opinionated individual. He believed that external events should be what is influencing behavior, that we can't possibly look at thoughts. Again, Skinner was very adamant that these techniques, these conditioning techniques, can and should be used on other people to shape their behaviors. And there are many applications for this, such as teaching, such as learning sports skills, increasing productivity in the workplace, helping with parenting, a lot of different applications. So both classical and operant conditioning, they both involve associative learning in some way, shape, or form. But again, classical conditioning is focusing on these automatic responses that occur, whereas operant conditions are focused more on intentional behaviors and how they are reinforced by either positive reinforcements or punishments. So what about some of the other ways we learn? All animals have the capacity to learn, and some are biologically suited to certain ways of learning. So for example, rats are extremely influenced by taste aversions. If they learn to not like certain foods because they end up making them sick, they will stay away from those foods. And humans also have biological preferences. So they also focus, or we also focus on taste aversions to food. And interestingly enough, we see, for example, the color red enhances attraction. So we're biologically attuned maybe to how colors influences mood or interactions with other people. So when we talk about classical and operant conditioning, we're primarily talking about learning through experience. We respond to stimuli in a different way because they're associated with one another in our environment that we're interacting with, or We behave in certain ways because they're punished or reinforced, but we can learn in other ways. We can learn, for example, by observing other people or observing specific events or by having someone tell us new information. So what are some of these ways? So for example, automatic associations influence our attitudes. So it's not necessarily all about our intentional focus or our awareness of how we're reacting to the environment. For example, we can sometimes be primed to behave in certain ways or primed to learn certain things. If we, for example, associate positivity with certain neutral stimuli, we might end up becoming or having more positive attitudes towards those stimuli. Our thoughts influence learning. So for example, we've shown that rats actually learn a maze, learn the kind of the format of a maze before any rewards or punishments are present in the maze. So they have this information ready and waiting for them, basically waiting for the reinforcement or the reward to be placed in the maze, and then they know exactly how to navigate it. Motivations can also influence our behaviors. We can have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations to behave in certain ways. So with intrinsic motivations, we want to behave in that way because it makes us feel good. Extrinsic motivations are when we want to behave in a specific way to get a reward. Generally, we see that intrinsic motivations are better predictors of whether or not we're going to behave in that way. And sadly, if we are given extrinsic rewards for performing a behavior that is generally intrinsically motivated, we actually stop performing that behavior as much. We can also learn through observation, learn by watching other people and imitating them. We're very good at modeling, imitating specific behaviors, and we do a good job of learning that way. We also especially like to learn from people who are similar to us. Again, we are biologically designed to learn in specific ways, and learning through observation is one of them. Children often over-imitate adult behaviors, and we also have specific neurons in our brain known as mirror neurons that help us imitate and mimic other people. It helps makes emotions contagious. It helps us grasp other people's state of mind, basically helping us figuring out why people are doing what they're doing and whether or not we can apply that information in our own lives. So that's all I have today. Thank you for your time and attention. I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.